Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Harry Cooper, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the National Gallery of Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. But before I do, please turn off these little devices. I'm doing that right now. And I want to remind all of us that the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Lecture Series provides a forum for distinguished artists to discuss the genesis and evolution of their work in their own words. Dr. Barbara Lee Diamonstein-Spielvogel and Ambassador Carl Spielvogel, whom I'm glad to say is here with us, endowed the series in 1997 to make these conversations available to the public, and we do then make them available on our website as well. Annhamilton is one of the most brilliant, mercurial, hard-working, and deservedly honored of contemporary artists. I don't think she's going to go over her life story, so I will do that for you very briefly. She was born in Lima, is that right, Ohio? Or yes, you say Lima, in 1956, and received her BFA in textile design at the University of Kansas in 1979. From there, she went to the Distinguished Art School at Yale, where she received her MFA in sculpture. She taught at UC Santa Barbara from 85 to 91, and then decided to move back home, as it were, and since 2001 has been a professor at OSU, Ohio State University in Columbus. She's the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, yes, the Genius Award in 1993, and she represented the United States at the Venice Biennale in 1999. There are many other honors, including the Skowhegan Medal for Sculpture, the Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, and others. And I'm sure that you've seen her installations in great museums around the world, and possibly some of her public sculpture projects, several of them done in collaboration, I believe, with her husband, the architect Michael Mersil. And those include the Allegheny Riverfront Park in Pittsburgh and the Teardrop Park in Lower Manhattan. She's working on an installation at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis and has work in progress at UT Austin, and I think in many other places around the world. So I've happened on her work. My relation to her work is serendipitous. I happened on her work at the Venice Biennale, a really memorable work of art and architecture that involved that fine red dust cascading down the walls of a Braille inscription of poetry and Lincoln's second inaugural address, one of the best uses of that pavilion, I think, ever. Again, in Seattle and then in Denver, when I just happened to be in Denver at the time of the Democratic National Convention and got to participate in her sing-along there on the theme of O, Obama, and Circles by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I think, as you might gather, she's a kind of visual poet. She works with metaphors. She's very interested in the connections between writing, drawing, and sewing from her early experience in textiles, and also between speaking, seeing, singing, the eye, the mouth. You can get some feeling for this up on our mezzanine level, where we've installed several works, a couple of objects, and some photographs, which are the generous gift of Tony and Heather Podesta. So anyway, my relationship was serendipitous, and now I have ruined that by inviting you here for this formal presentation, which I'm very much looking forward to, so please welcome Annhamilton.
Harry, that was a lovely introduction. I think you should stay up here with me. No. No, you've tried that. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And thank you, Carl and Barbara Lee, who could not be here today, but is here in spirit, for making this possible for us to gather together. I was thinking as I was walking across that giant green lawn outside the mall, how, although I don't live in Washington, how much I love coming and thinking and imagining the museums that gather around its edges is like a lot of people gathered at an amazing dinner party. And that one of the things that I think, I don't know, that made me think about is how art happens as kind of an process of finding what you need. That when you're making, you're moving from what you know to what you don't know, and that you don't always know what you need, but you have to set up the conditions for finding it. And how the conditions of the museums and their the large collection that they make around the mall set up the conditions for multiple forms of finding. And so it seems to me that maybe it's a constellation that's a really wonderful studio. So we could think that we're inside the studio of Washington right now. I'm not sure that's the perspective of the White House, but anyway, thank you. I was also thinking, as I was kind of putting my thoughts together yesterday and the day before, how it's not only an act of finding, but work forms as an act of attention. And that because so much of my work has formed in relationship to a particular place and to visiting, that I often arrive to make a work really pretty blank, and that the practice of the studio is maybe just really cultivating how one pays attention to what you pay attention to. And that it's not an accident when your vision or your thought process or your body is drawn one way or another. And so what I wanted to do today was maybe talk about some of those forms of attention, the ways in which we listen, the ways in which we see and pay attention, and how those kind of the embodied sort of experience of listening through all of our senses is what comes to form the practice of the work. So I think for I don't have it to hold up, but the announcement for the show, I was pleased to see that it's one of the very first pieces I made, which maybe brings together the figure, the sculpture, the textile hand in me, which is really my first hand. And it's a suit that's covered in toothpicks, but standing in it is to become aware of one's skin and one's exterior projection as a giant kind of membrane for listening. And it's really the embodied knowledge of that attention that comes to make the work. And thinking also a lot about what does it mean to make by hand at an age of technological extension, that we have, I can at night talk to Korea by Skype, and I can text my son at school, and that we are all amplified infinitely around the globe. And yet, what is the importance still of what is most immediate in one's tactile range, the reach of one's voice, or the extension of one's hand to touch, and the reciprocity of that. And so how, what is the place, I guess, of making by hand in the technologies that do extend us, and how is that a form, how are those forms of embodied thinking part of what we carry forward into the technologies that we make? As bodies, we obviously, I'm stating the obvious here, but we inherit all those relations that also make so many of our, the metaphors that we often habitually think through, of being an inside and an outside, of being, a right and a left, a back and a front, of being bodied, of being a visceral body, and being an organism that can always also language our experience in symbolic abstraction, and the two of those, how the finger extended, which is what you see here, which becomes almost like a lens or an eye, both absorbs what it knows from language and spells language out, and this kind of fluidity back and forth between the ways of knowing that each offers. I think that this was once shown, I'm trying to think where this was, and somebody looked at it and they said, is this happening inside my body? But I have been very fortunate. I did move home. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and my second home there is the Wexner Center, and they have an art and technology program where they have supported the kind of editing and production work of a lot of video artists. And it's really because of being there that I first ended up with a camera in my hand at all. But to think about, how does the camera not put you maybe in an exterior position of looking out on something, but how can it be used in such a way that it puts you inside the act, whether that's an act of observation or an act of reading? And so I'm going to show you a little bit later, but I've been working for a long time with a camera that's really the size of the end of my finger, because what I can do is I can move it around and not be looking through any kind of screen or lens, but actually conducting the camera as a way of touching. And so how does the act of seeing become a tactile sort of experience has been how I've approached using video. And it's because so much of the possibility of becoming interior to something is to perhaps at the same moment lose one's weight, to give up one's border, and to achieve a kind of impossible weightlessness, unless, like me, you go a lot to the state fair. I think this is my favorite ride. And it's partly that I think we long, and it has a lot to do with making art, because it's this longing to be so present that you're completely absorbed, and that you lose a kind of self-consciousness of your presence as you become more present. And there are many ways to get there. Drugs, I suppose, for some people. But this playing in a more serious way back and forth between the body's edges is where the work occurs. And then that really has a lot to do with how I've come to meet architecture. Like I'm kind of like I think I'm a little bit like a goldfish in the sense that you grow to meet the bowl that you're in. And so my work has formed at the perimeters of the architecture where I've been invited to work. But it's always about trying to bring the scale of the hand to meet the scale of that sort of more volumetric, immersive space. And to think about, I think always what's the kind of most fundamental, almost indexical extension of the hand. And so, in fact, I don't know what happened. I don't draw, but I can draw with a camera in my hand. And I think that that's how video has become very fluid for me. So whether it's a stylus that for the first time is writing out the letters of an alphabet in cursive form, the kind of attention that forms around that act of the contact between, in this case, the glass and the knitting needle in my hand. Or the drawing forth of a thread over and under, over and under, over and under. The sort of incessant horizontality of the thread in cloth and in weaving is linked to the horizontality of our reading in the Roman alphabet. And that the processes of accumulation that come from lap work I think maybe the first process that I really learned as a kid was to knit. And thinking about how knitting is something where each individual loop of the yarn around the needle accretes to make this larger field, but yet it retains and is transparently really present to you visually its sort of individual stitch. And that's how the work has grown to meet the scale of architecture, is really out of this kind of way of knowing or thinking about how a larger field might accrue or accumulate or accrete in some way. But so many of our extensions are actually prosthetic, and it's how the hand extends to space and then beyond our bodies that then forms kind of the larger enclosure of the work. I always need help. So I thought I would better start with that kind of image. But this is a project that is the literal step from the knitting of the cloth that's on your lap to making the field that then is meeting the scale of the space that it's in, but extends out of the same kind of sensibility and sense of time. And this is a project that was at Cap Street Project in San Francisco in the Mission District. And the budget for the project was $8,000. And we took that and exchanged it for pennies. And so 800,000 pennies became the material of the work. And the substance, the pennies, which are obviously a product of a human abstraction and a system of exchange, were set into a skin of honey, which you can see there in the top of the image. And that honey leached and ran outside the perimeter of the field of pennies. And when you walked in off of the street in the Mission District, which was, I think, a much rougher place than it is right now, this was a former garage, you could smell the animals, because in the back there were 3 sheep that were living for the duration of the exhibition. And when we were done, we washed all the money with a cement mixer. We recounted it, and it went to pay for the costs of doing the project. So it did double duty. So there must be some investment, like sort of metaphor there. But this project actually is opening the door to a project I'm going to end with, because I borrowed these sheep from a man who had a 4-H project that kind of went awry, he would say, and grew to be quite a large flock. And then I ended up doing quite a large project with him later. But I initially met him, Steve Oliver, and he was just a person who had sheep that was willing to let them live in the city. And when the kids would come in from the school at the end of the block, there was a kid who found this piece. And so it's a little bit like wandering in off the mall. And we left the garage door open, and he came in and found it. And he started giving people in the neighborhood tours. And then one day, one of the kids went running across the pennies, and he took them down. So, all of the greediness, the selfishness, the generosity that is part of the material substance in some ways also manifested itself in different ways in the social life around this project. There was also always a caretaker, a person present, wringing their hands in a hat full of honey. So together, the wringing of the hands, the kind of immersion in the sort of product of the animal hive, and the chewing of the animals, all of the felt qualities of those are together what make the piece. So to me, the piece is not necessarily the thing you see, but it's that moment where the senses are in conjunction, and you smell the sheep and you see the money. And together, like that moment in time and that perception really becomes a sheep. They lived on a bed of alfalfa, and so they became very fat. Because this would be like living on a bed of steaks. And Steve told me when they went back and they were sheared that year for their wool that they were embarrassed. I don't know. But I actually didn't want to stop and describe these in a lot of details, but to talk about the way that you can see in some of these earlier installations that the hand making, the making by hand, the felt presence of the many hands that go into making these pieces, that they literally become textiles that, or a membrane that you walk into and you become interior to them and their surround. This was a project that was in Toronto, and these are dummy forms that are based on Greek wrestling figures, and they're all stuffed with sawdust and then piled one on the other. And they become very sound absorbing. And so it's hard to see in this photograph, but on the structural pillars at the power plant in Toronto, which is where this was located, there are these punching bags, and they're mechanized. So every once in a while, they would just flail and hit the columns, and it would make this really loud sound. So it would almost make the canvas floor and everything into a boxing ring. And there was a person who was there on a regular schedule, not all the time, knitting. And they were knitting on a set of circular needles, and they would stand up when they ran out of yarn and undo the next line. And so eventually, over time, the idea was, we never got there, but that each of these cases, which was the size of the bodies on the wall, it would undo the divide in the space and not be just a futile act. But again, the knitting, the sort of social accretion, the material accretion, and the kind of social metaphors that are in the body of a cloth are very much the underlayment for the way I've thought about approaching space, and always working, as I said, to its edge. This project called Tropos that was at the Dia Foundation, before Chelsea was really at all what it is today. I think there was only one gallery in Chelsea when Dia opened, when I was working in this space. And when I did the site visit with this, I was really thinking a lot about how when you were inside, you had this kind of quality of light and this filtered sound, and like the ice cream truck, or like there would be a sound that would draw your attention to the edge of the window. And so as I was circling the space, my attention kept being drawn to the light and to the voice and to the sound outside. And this is the beginning of my kind of bringing the voice not from the center out, but from the outside in. And in this project, the title of which, Tropos, really comes from Natalie Serbrot's book, Tropisms, which is about, she writes about preparing oneself to make from the interior before one actually, how one prepares oneself inside to speak, but before one speaks or writes. And so I worked with an actor who had aphasia, had a stroke, and made some recordings with him that are outside the window in this room that is covered with the tail hair of horses in an undulating oceanic kind of expanse that kind of plunges you into its terrain. And the voice, which is ever out of reach, because as you approach the window, it would move away from you. So it was not so much about the legibility, obviously, of the voice, but it's about the difficulty of articulating and coming to speech. And in the middle of it, there was a small table. The table is like my blank page, I think. It's me thinking about that always as a social space. And there was a whole group of readers who sat and read at the table with a hot stylus in their hands. So they're reading at the pace of the hand burning. And the transformation is that the words become smoke, and the smoke is reabsorbed by the horsehair. And so the printed word becomes and is reabsorbed by the animal. And the cycle of the piece really, for me, was that absorption. And in Leon, kind of a similar thing with a voice, a calling back and forth between a student and a teacher was over this was in Leon at the Renzo piano building, which had recently opened, the Museum of Contemporary Art. And we opened the galleries, so the whole thing was open, and all the light came through. It opened all the skylights, and then made a second membrane within it that was a way not of trying to fill the space, but engage and make present kind of the volume of its air. But again, it extends from this very simple gesture of the hand. It's like when you make your bed, you go like this with the sheet. That became this piece. And so below is, there are 5 peacocks, and it's their space. You walk into the space of the animal, and the cloth is lifted at one end mechanically and then dropped from springs that are at the opposite side. So it breathes. And there's a hole up through it where there is a, as you can see, a telephone pole. And that's where the figure pulls the inked typewriter ribbon up through to weave and make and define the cavity of the hand by using the fingers as the warp threads on a loom. And those are passed down below. And this place where they gathered, you can see in the bottom corner here, is where the peacocks really liked to sleep and gather. But their calling in the space underneath in this horizon is in response to each other, to the people coming in, but also to the voice that's just out of reach, that is above the light. And partly today what I'm going to talk about is how, or hope I get to it, is how that voice comes in and becomes the central spine and the figure of the work. I don't know that the National Gallery had let peacocks. No. That might be pushing it. In fact, I have to say that I think a lot of the work that I have been able to make, I don't know that I could make it now. You know, I think that the atmosphere for certain kinds of risk has shifted. Harry, in his generous introduction, mentioned Venice, and these 2 shots are from looking at the front of Venice, one through the glass wall that we built across its front, and then once inside the courtyard, the room that glass wall made, and how it liquefied the kind of architectural stability of this form, which when I visited, I went right afterwards to Monticello, because I was thinking about Monticello and the roots of American democracy and how they're expressed in architecture. And every bank in Iowa, I think both were kind of in my mind. And it was 1999, and I was thinking about how do you engage this moment in history, and how through abstraction can you also address a kind of absence. So this piece is a lecture in itself, probably, but this is the glass wall. And that was built across the front. So if you approach the building from across the Giardini, you saw your reflection, and you saw this kind of liquefied front of the building through it. And when you entered, you saw that we had actually opened the skylights in all the galleries, which had been covered over for, I think, like 20 years or something. So it's always this wanting to bring the light in at the edge, and the sort of changeability of light and how it animates a space. But here I felt, how do I take on this building as both the object and the subject of the work? And in some ways, is there a way for me as an American, and with the complicated honor of representing the country in this context, think about how we make presence, maybe the story that isn't told on this facade. And so the braille that is on the walls is the translation of Charles Reznikoff's 2-volume work, which is an accounting of property and racial violence at the turn of the century, the previous century, and it was based on court records. And it's like an accounting, and it has a real kind of almost a beautiful litmus quality that's like, and then this happened, and then this, because the actions accumulate their own meaning. And and that was not read, but it was translated, and you couldn't really obviously read it, but falling in front of it was this cascade of really intense fuchsia powder that was not a really natural color, and it leaked at the edges, but it was such a fine micro size that it doesn't stick on the braille. So it's this partly thinking about how do we talk about the things that aren't talked about? How do we account for the kind of violence that's part of every culture's history, every state's history? And, where in some ways do those stories or narratives stick to us? Because the powder really traced itself all over Venice. I don't know if you remember getting on and off the Vaporetto, but the powder was trailing around the city. And, I think my question partly as an artist is like, can you make an absence present without filling in what that is? And can you make a space that people can walk into? The thing about this piece is that it really changed depending on the weather and who was in it. And if it was full of people, it kind of disappeared. And if there was only one or two people, then the weather of it would come, so it would emerge and disappear. And if you followed the voice that actually came from the corner, a speaker in the corner of each of the symmetrically arranged rooms off of the small rotunda, you could actually in code follow Lincoln's second inaugural address. And so I was thinking about in this piece that I realized how much reading had become part of my studio practice, and that maybe how one reads is a form of drawing and how that comes into the work. And so that started me on this kind of path of thinking much more consciously about how maybe the mouth is the first installation, and this cavity of the mouth, which is not an object, but a hollow space in the body where we both ingest the outside. It's a place of sensual pleasure. It's where our language erupts up through us and extends out. And yet we're never supposed to be caught with our mouths open in public. And the scale of the mouth is like the hand. It starts in the same place from this intimate scale of the body. So how one draws forth from it like I said, you're never supposed to have your mouth open in public. It's embarrassing to most people, and because it's like a hole in the body that's not supposed to be made visible. And so some of this, early work was really thinking about that. This thread that's being pulled is actually hand-spun thread that I found in my basement that I had made as a younger person. And it becomes the horizon that eventually becomes language in the work. But this pulling out is also sometimes a pulling in. And so taking the mouth and the ear and these orifices as reciprocal sites of listening and speaking, of ingesting and expelling, became, I started to think about those in some way, the same way I was maybe approaching architecture. And perhaps the ambivalence of which direction, what's pouring in or flowing out, and then later in this one. This one is kind of uncomfortable. But these are actually small clay marbles from the flea market. The flea market's my other studio. And I think partly the street, it's such an interesting place because when I travel, I always go to the markets because you know so much about a place immediately by what you find there. But also it's like one of those places where I think one tests how you pay attention, and that every time you're drawn to a different thing, and the material history of objects comes forward and directs your attention in different places. And so it's sort of the equivalent of being able to wander aimlessly in the library and pull things off the shelf because the red spine catches your attention, and then serendipitously you open to a page which has the line that you needed to read at that particular moment. But taking quite literally the mouth as a site of making in this project, Malediction, was maybe one of the first steps towards my work, moving towards words. And I sat with putting dough, forming the palette, interior palette of my mouth with it, taking it out and putting it in this basket where the dough would swell to some extent as if it might reconstitute in a futile way the body that is absent. And these baskets were used to carry a body in the 19th century, I think, from the home to the morgue or the hospital to the morgue. And the horizon of cloth is sheets, linens, wine stained behind it. So it became a kind of, I guess, a ritual process of sitting and reconstituting from a formless mass something that had definition that came from inside the body, putting it in the basket, and then it, in time, reabsorbing into this larger mass. But of course, this was the first project I had done in a gallery, and so I was at the time working with Sean Kelly, and Sean would sneak out with a plate. I think you should know this, and he would take some of the dough pieces and bake them. And so that's the only reason the piece really survives. He's like, Anne, we have to save these. But thinking also about how the site of the mouth, like the hand extended with the camera, is where touch extends to sight. I was thinking about that when one opens one's mouth, the site of language exiting, how does it become an eye? And so this has been an ongoing project that has had several different forms, but I made some small pinhole cameras that fit inside the cavity of my mouth, which is quite large. And so when I stand, I didn't think about this so much as taking pictures, but making a condition to stand face to face with another person, because there's no apparatus of the technology between the two of us. And so it's a really strangely formal and intimate kind of act, really. And what happens is that or at least I ask people, don't look at my mouth, because there's an exchange that happens sometimes with a total stranger which is the proximity of your two eyes, and that the word pupil means the little puppet in your eye, and you actually see yourself upside down in the person's eye that you're standing next to. And so I was thinking about how it was maybe very related to when I sat in a piece, burning the books, reading the books, or doing the dough, that there's a way you allow yourself to be present, that you're both very strong and you're very vulnerable at the same time. And I think what the work is trying to do is set up different kinds of conditions for those experiences. This is actually my niece, Manette. And, my niece and my son, Emmett, are like, we hate it when you do these weird things. And then over time, they're like, my mom takes pictures with her mouth. Isn't that great? But it's I think that part of it's the duration of time, and all of this is slow in some way. And maybe it's because my life is actually not slow at all, and it's like the work is a way that I can make slowness in my life that I don't have otherwise. The way that I work is often to work on site. And some of you are maybe more familiar with the installation work, but this is one of the extraordinary situations this is in southern Sweden, in a little tiny town called Venice that's near Malmo. And where I was asked, and when I arrived, I didn't leave for 6 weeks, and we made the whole project in that. I mean, we had planning, and I had site visits before I went, but this incredible luxury of being able to immerse in making in a way that I don't normally, because I don't really have a studio practice in that traditional sense. So this is the castle of this former estate that is in Sweden, inherited by successive generations, and they become the steward of this land. And Charles and Marika Wachtmeister he's a forester. He's trained in forestry and agriculture, and he's been converting things back to wetlands. He's been trying to make the property self-sufficient in energy. He's established the largest organic dairy in that part of Europe. And all of the economy of this land has been partly in concert with supporting the sculpture and art projects that have taken place there. And so the barn that you see on the left-hand side is where I was invited to work. And I am a space hog. I have to say that Charles and Marika asked me when we met in New York if I wanted one floor of the barn. And I think I probably paused for about 30 seconds. I didn't respond immediately. And so Charles said, well, do you want the whole thing? And I did. But it's because it's sort of like reading, and I think this kind of goes to the Venice piece, like that there's a way that the experience of the piece is this way that it unfolds in time and accretes in your body as you move through it. And so the 5 stories of the barn and its 5 material horizons allowed me to make a piece that finally brought the voice into the center spine. And it was a place where grain had been stored and I think dried, and I think it was very much like the bank for the property, because it's where all the tenant farmers would deliver the harvest. And and you could see evidence in this wood building of the body, of the carrying up of the sacks, the marking of all of the posts with numerical Roman numerals from when it was built, I think in 1823. And we cannibalized these Leslie speakers. And usually you hear rock and roll out of these. But I recorded the singing of all the people that helped work on this project and my time in the barn. And so the voice moving up and down through these turning speakers in their electromechanical system passed through each of the floors. There were 5 of them that passed up and down. And one horizon was one of reading, a Summer Lagersloff story, who's the woman who wrote Pippi's Longstockings. And it was kind of a moral fable about animals and humans. And then this crossing is the same crossing that happens in weaving. And not to labor the point, but the intersection, the event of a thread is the intersection where 2 things make contact, which is touch and cloth, and now it's sound in this piece moving up through the building. So the next floor is a dance floor that we installed, inspired by the beautiful library floor in the castle that's the adjacent building. And in that, we set a floor that would spin. And so rather than it would inverse the relationship of you moving around the building to it moving around you as you stepped onto this spinning disc and became in concert with the spinning speakers that are moving up through it. There you see. And this is an A.R. Emmons poem that I'm reading that is about making and what can we make with our hands, but in a sort of larger philosophical sense. And you can see that then that actually becomes a weaving, because as it goes up through the building, it's the next layer addresses your body at waist height, and it's a whole horizon of work tables that have been carved in the surface and cut with accounting lines of a medieval counting table, and is an address in some ways to the economy of the forest as a resource or as a reserve. And also on here you hear how to use that or read the accounting lines. But you also at a certain point hear the cows. Let's see. Let me see if you hear the cows here, maybe. So it's always in a different relationship to wherever you are in the building. There. And the thing about the cows is that, how's my time? Am I running out of time already? Let's see. Okay, Mark. I have to finish in 10 minutes? Okay, oh my God, okay. I tried to cut this down. Is that the man who took care of the animals, when he came to work at the property in Venice, this piece is called Lignum, he didn't speak, and it was really that he was returned in many ways to his voice through working with the animals. And I used to go and sit in the barn, and I was really interested in how the animals obviously pay attention. They never forget that you're there. And this kind of the settling of attention and watching you. And might that be one of the forms of attention that animated this piece? As you walked up, you walked into darkness. That floor, you can see this floor is warped up to the level of your eyes, and then above it, the cloth that was actually in those paper packages that you saw on the first floor is actually over the beams. And so there's almost a history here that is a history of the body that's told by the classical profile of the building, and that the shoot through it is this movement of the voice. And it is like the neck. It's like the voice that comes from here that connects our feet, to our eyes. That is our vocal cord that started to become, I think, the form that was influencing me or I was thinking about. So here you can see a really early video of this kind of excess of water in my throat, which kind of looks like a chicken here. But that became the architectural form that is the place where the voice really becomes the center of the piece following the project in Sweden. And this is at Oliver Ranch in Northern California. Well, it's north of San Francisco, an hour and a half. And it was a commission by Steve Oliver, who has a property. And he's the man that I borrowed the sheep from. And when he first asked me, I don't usually work outside. My works are always interior, and it took me 13 years to make a proposal. But there were 13 years full of wonderful lunches and conversations and very good wine. And it was like I was I had to walk it into my body, and my work was changing during all those, obviously, 13 years. And I was thinking about, could I make a vocal cord for the ranch? And I have spent 25 years in making installations that are, for the most part, temporary and ephemeral. And might I make a space that was something in itself, but it created an opportunity for other people to respond to it. And so Steve, whose property is somewhat limited because it's surrounded by vineyards, and the prices of land in that part of the country are very high. And so we started talking about what it would mean to make something that was its ongoing life, just like I had once had sitters in my work, and attendants and caregivers became the programming. And it's because of these This is Jessica in the front, these sheep. And so we started the conversation building a tower that would meet the horizon and that would rise to meet the trees from a draw in the land. And it took 3 years to build, and it opened a couple of years ago. And you see here in this image, you see Meredith Monk, who is a friend and an artist that I've worked with, and she and some of her ensemble opened it and then later came back and made, I'm going to show you a small part of this film that we made. It's not really a completed piece, but it's a document of part of that project with Meredith. One of the things just to describe this is that it's, you know, I live in the Midwest. I spent a lot of time looking at silos and talking to Steve about the well in Orvieto in Italy where he travels. And each step in this is like a quarter of an inch wider than the step before it, not in its depth, but in its distance from the wall. So what happens is you ascend towards light, you're actually compressed physically against the wall. So it's like there's these two opposite movements. And the idea, in part, was to make a double helix, so a staircase that could have maybe the performers on one and the audience on the other. And so I'm going to show you actually a piece of people getting into the tower. Yeah. So this tells you a lot about Steve. This fact that there's irregularity in the circumference of the interior, so the handrail is all bent in place. Each stair is slightly different than the one below. Those are things your body registers. And when I visited, I realized that, I wonder if I can stretch this in here. No. I realized that it shouldn't have a door. So originally we had 2 doors at the bottom. And that if we did that, we wouldn't be able to return the topography to its kind of original form. And there's a lot of structure in the ground because it's very near a fault line. So it goes down almost as high as it goes up with these concrete piers. But that you had to kind of duck in. And so Steve, I'm going to show you pictures here, is that what we did was take one of the light wells that brings light to the inside but no view, and cut out the bottom half. And then we were able to fill in the ground so that there were 2 of them opposite each other. So now when you enter the tower, you have to duck in. And you're just like right onto the stair. And I think it was because I was like, oh, it's the threshold. It's not about a threshold. It's about this complete interiority of this interior form that's about 24 feet across. And that's what I was supposed to show you. And so now every year there are a couple of projects that are commissioned for this space, and each one is a fundraiser for an arts organization in San Francisco. And so Steve is partnering with me to kind of do the curating, but also to make it can hold about 150 people on one staircase. And so each of the events becomes a fundraiser either for the institution or for the artists. It kind of changes. And I don't know if any of you know Joanna Highgood, who is an aerialist who does really extraordinary choreography, often from ropes. And she is doing something in early October. The bottom is a well, but it's not a deep well. It's just a well of water that you can actually stand in. And what it does really is it reflects the sky, so that the sky and the ground are connected through this staircase. And this is, you get a little more of a sense of where it is. And this is a project that Joe Good did with the San Francisco Girls Chorus. And Kronos worked with Supanga, who had never written music for a Western instruments, and came, he's Javanese, and came, and they made a piece that responded to the acoustics of this space. And Shrok Yadagari, who's a Persian composer who lives in San Diego, he worked with traditional musicians and contemporary electronics to make a piece that I found really extraordinary. And I've gone on to work a little bit further with Shrok. And I'm going to try to get to that piece, okay? It's the race. But the other hollow that I was invited to work with is one you all know and is really extraordinary, is the Guggenheim. And Alexandra Monroe asked me to participate in an exhibition that was looking at the influence of Asian thought on American artists up kind of to the age of the internet. And I was invited to kind of respond to the show. And she at first was going to put me in a side gallery, or said, you know, would you be interested in this beautiful gallery, beautiful volume? And I was like, what if, you know, there's this big space out there. And I wanted to make something that would be everywhere and nowhere, and that would pass through but not have a fixed form, and that would have no electronics in it. And partly I've been doing a lot of other work that had a lot of electronics in it. And I wanted to respond to her thesis on the exhibition, which was the influence that happened through the arrival of certain books and their translations, and the particular translations. And so the influences of the culture that came initially through writing. And so I worked with that bibliography to some degree. But what I was thinking about how is that there's no accounting for how one person reads and what falls out into your lap or into your experience, or is like the bell literally sounding and making a connection in your own mind. And so we took multiple books and we cut them up and we reconstituted them. So as book weights, they were remaking juxtapositions that one could never really read. And they were the counterweight within a system that rimmed the whole rotunda. And started at the top. We bent a pipe. I worked with a wonderful engineer, Marty Chafkin, and it follows the parapet wall. And then you'll see that we have skateboard wheels and a little carriage that carries the bell down. Should have a little sound. Let's see, sometimes it didn't get going. And so this kind of stupid little thing, you know, 4 pieces of cloth and 2 bells would trace the path down. And each time it went, it did go a little bit differently. So it was very in tune, I think, with some of the ideas of the exhibition, but it passed through the whole show. And as you were looking at the galleries and turned towards the wall on the inside, the sound would turn you, which is just like the voice calling you to the exterior in the earlier work. Now it's calling into the inside. And here it is. And every so you could hear the kids going, "Where is it?" somebody said to me they loved it because you could go in and see it and you didn't have to pay. But so much of my life has been spent reading and thinking about how reading is like drawing, and how I think how one reads is one studio, and the kind of permission that gathers to me from the pages of a book, but also how the proximity of the book and the pages in front of you, which are proximate, always connect you to this large place outside the book, which is distance, which you find inside that. And I think that was partly very much in my thought as I was developing this piece. And but it was an act of human care. I worked with an artist, Audra Wolowick, and she pulled this up and down almost every day. There were 3 people, but it was largely Audra who made the exchange of the bell and the bell carriage for a new weight, and really kept the cycle of the work going. And sometimes like this, you can see it didn't always make it down. Like, it was like on cue. And so it was like a live thing. And it was, there was one day that, I shouldn't tell you this, but it's such a good story, that one of the safeties on one of the bells fell off. It wore, and it was a mistake in the way it had been put on. And it fell into someone's pocket. I mean, it could have been really bad. It could have really hurt someone. And it fell into this man's pocket. And then I thought, okay, like we are doing something right. And it was really, wonderful to watch people just fall into the kind of attention of this and the stories around this. Like when I would come, and the guards who were most intimately know the work and the habits of the crowd, this every day it behaved a little differently. And so there was always like this story they had about its behavior. And that's partly also the making of the work. This is my studio, and it's winter when we were making this, so it was cold. And some of the students that gather around the project, but also, that continues right on into the museum. This is the crew at the Guggenheim. They're all like chimney sweeps and climbers, and they do amazing aerial things. And so they were fantastic installing this. They spent hours, you can imagine, adjusting the pipes to get it to work with gravity and to continue down. And that was a picture of Marty. And he's the kind of engineer that's like, let's not worry about like exactly how it's going to work, but why are we making it? And that's where our conversation starts. And then from these projects, I started looking at the materials that emerged from it. So these are some of the book weights that we scanned and made prints out of, realizing that each one, in some ways, like the paper hands I started with, is like a portrait of making. Each one is made by a different person in the studio. And these are large prints that start to, like, they embody that hand, and they're not a facial portrait, but they're like a portrait of the hand touching material. And maybe what I should do is finish with the project, which is the silent counterpart to this, which is the boat that's on the Mekong in Luang Prabang, and was built with France Morin, the curator, and her project, The Quiet in the Land. And she asked 20 artists to come and really spend time in the place and make a piece that would in some way emerge from that experience. And I made something that stayed there. And it was inspired by the walking meditation structures that are mostly, we found 3 in ruin and 1 restored, which you see here. And thinking about the place of silence and the pressures on that silence as the market moves in and the tourism moves in, and the incredible pressure on the peninsula of a World Heritage Site, which is a very complicated honor and a complicated development issue for the local population. And so the whole support system for the temples for the Sangha, the community, is really shifted because of this arrival. And so I worked with Satu Ankeo, who's the monk you see here, who was trying to establish a meditation school and to kind of continue the education that the novices only have sometimes through that structure. And several generations of that lost practice because of obviously the political circumstances and the legacy of the war. And so we built this boat, and it's there. It's on the Mekong. And it is, I'm sure, used, I think, maybe a little bit for walking meditation, but a lot for other things, I hope. And we took some of the novices out who had never been on the river. And they said, oh, it's hard to concentrate, Anne. It's hard to meditate, but until we get used to the water. But it's, it's a vessel, I think, of quiet that's suspended in a place of motion and constant change, which is the history and story of the river and of cultures coming in and leaving and economies coming in. And so it is at the very end of this. It took a couple years to build it, but it took a year and a half to give it away, because making a gift is a complicated thing. And Satu said, it's not a gift if it has conditions, thinking that I intended it only to have this one use of the meditation. And that wasn't my intention, but it was almost like we had to talk about it for a year and a half for the exchange to be the right circumstance. And maybe for me to understand that you don't really need a structure to be quiet, that quiet is, and silence is something you carry within yourself. But the community of people that made this possible, which you see here, and the women who took me on one of their retreats and tried to teach me how to sit in silence. I'm not very good at that. But, we didn't share language, but we shared a kind of recognition and an empathy across the language we couldn't speak. And then it became theirs. And I had to borrow it back for the very last thing. These are the documents of exchange. I had a 40-page contract that came from New York, and he gave me a one-page piece of paper. And that tells you a lot about the two cultures and the responsibilities of a gift. And so let's see if I can get the sound up. The last night, I had always wanted to tether this boat of silence to a boat of sound. And so the court musicians whose work had been unpracticed and not much heard in the culture with the loss of the crown, the royalty, played some of their traditional music and were towed by the boat. And this moment in this sunset is the piece, really, for me. Do you want to see that again? It's like sometimes you make these huge, huge projects for this thing to happen. And you can't determine or know in advance that that's going to happen. But the making is the making of a condition that allows it. So. And it's about how you pay attention, which is, I think, why it took so long to give it away, because I had to learn that. And the other thing about this is that the form of it, it's like a shuttle in a loom, which I didn't even realize until I started looking at this video, is that the shape of it and its structure is just like the shuttle crossing the shed in an open loom in the process of weaving. So I think that I have run through my time, and so thank you.